1909. Theodore Roosevelt, the most famous man in America, just finished being President of the United States, and he's about to go on the adventure of a lifetime, a hunting expedition across East Africa. Like most Americans at the time, Roosevelt thought he knew what Africa was: jungles, wild animals, and what he called uncivilized tribes. American textbooks barely mentioned African history. If they did, it was always the same story: primitive, backward, savage. But then Roosevelt arrived in Uganda, and he met representatives of a king named Daudi Chwa, a 15-year-old ruling one of Africa's most sophisticated kingdoms. And what Roosevelt discovered in the Kingdom of Buganda would command his respect, forcing him to reconcile what he'd been taught about Africa with what he'd actually seen. This is that story. Before we get to Buganda, you need to understand who Theodore Roosevelt was in 1909. He'd just finished serving as the 26th President of the United States. He was a war hero, leader of the famous Rough Riders Cavalry Unit, a conservationist who created America's national parks, a trust buster who broke up corrupt monopolies. Basically, Roosevelt was a legend, still is. But he was also a man of his time, and his time was the early 1900s, an era when most white Americans, including Roosevelt, believed in racial hierarchies. Roosevelt had written that black Americans were, quote, altogether inferior to whites in the mass. He believed Native Americans were savages and that white civilization needed to expand across the continent. He supported eugenics, a pseudoscientific belief that you could improve humanity by controlling who had children. In 1906, he dishonorably discharged 167 black soldiers in what's called the Brownsville Affair. They were accused of a shooting they didn't commit. It took the US Army 66 years to exonerate them. But here's where it gets complicated. In 1901, Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington, a prominent black educator, to dinner at the White House. This was considered scandalous. Southern politicians condemned him. Some newspapers called it the worst thing a president had ever done. So Roosevelt was contradictory. He held racist beliefs typical of his era, but occasionally did things that challenged those norms. Keep that in mind, because Buganda is about to complicate his worldview even further. By April 1909, Roosevelt had been hunting across East Africa for months, Kenya, Tanzania, collecting specimens for the Smithsonian Institution. Then he entered Uganda, and everything changed. The Kingdom of Buganda sat on the northern shores of Lake Victoria, one of the largest lakes in the world. It had been a powerful, independent kingdom for over 600 years. 600 years. To put that in perspective, Buganda had a functioning government before Christopher Columbus sailed to America, before the United States existed, before the British Empire even thought about Africa. In 1909, the king, the Kabaka, was a teenager named Daudi Chwa II. He was only 15 years old, having become king at age 3 when his father died. Because Daudi Chwa was so young, the kingdom was run by a council of regents and, most importantly, by the Katikiro, the Prime Minister. His name was Apollo Kaggwa, and when Roosevelt met him, his mind was blown. Here's what Roosevelt expected to find. Maybe a chief in a hut, some basic tribal structure, nothing sophisticated. Here's what he actually found. The Kabaka wasn't just a king. He was the political, spiritual, and military leader of over 1 million people. But, and this is crucial, he didn't rule alone. Buganda had checks and balances. Buganda had a parliament called the Lukiiko with 292 representatives. Some were appointed by the king, others were elected by regional chiefs, and some inherited their positions. They debated laws. They advised the king. They could even challenge royal decisions. Roosevelt wrote that this system was one of the best organized and most civilized of African kingdoms at the present day. Then there was Apollo Kaggwa, the Prime Minister. This man was extraordinary. He spoke multiple languages. He was a Christian convert who'd also preserved traditional Buganda culture. He'd written books documenting Buganda's history and customs. He was a skilled diplomat who'd negotiated with the British. When Roosevelt met Kaggwa, he was stunned. This wasn't a primitive chief. This was a sophisticated political leader who could hold his own in any European capital. Buganda had courts, multiple levels of courts. You could appeal decisions. There were judges, legal procedures, and established laws. Wide roads connected the capital to regional centres. Administrative districts had governors. There was a postal system, trade routes, markets. Buganda maintained a 10,000-strong professional army. They had a navy, 30,000 war canoes built from trees specifically harvested for military purposes. These canoes controlled Lake Victoria and the surrounding waterways. Winston Churchill, yes, that Churchill, visited Buganda around the same time and called it the Pearl of Africa. Roosevelt couldn't believe it. None of this matched what he'd been taught about Africa. So, what exactly did Roosevelt see during his visit? He attended ceremonies at the Royal Palace. He met with Prime Minister Kaggwa multiple times. He was given tours of government buildings. He watched military demonstrations. At one point, the royal musicians performed for him, and they knew how to play the Star-Spangled Banner, the American national anthem. Roosevelt was shocked. How did a kingdom in the heart of Africa know American music? Because Buganda wasn't isolated. They'd been trading with Arabs for centuries. They'd been in diplomatic contact with Britain since the 1880s. King Mutesa I, Daudi Chwa's grandfather, had sent letters to Queen Victoria. After leaving Uganda, Roosevelt gave a series of speeches in London that shocked the British establishment. He praised Buganda's political organisation. He said the experience had made him rethink his negative views of African people. He even subtly criticised British colonialism, saying, quote, "You realise how things are abroad." For context, this was a former US president essentially telling the British Empire, hey, maybe these Africans know what they're doing. The British were not amused. But here's the complicated part. Roosevelt's core beliefs didn't disappear overnight. He still believed in racial hierarchies. He still supported American imperialism. He still held many of the same views he'd had before. But something had shifted. He could no longer claim that all African societies were uncivilized. He had seen a pearl, a kingdom with a history older than his own nation, a place that forced an American president to rethink the very nature of civilization itself, and that mattered. Fast forward to 1912, Roosevelt decides to run for president again, but this time with a new party, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. And his platform on race was unusual for a white politician in 1912. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded just 3 years earlier, backed Roosevelt over the other candidates. Why? Because Roosevelt's platform included some progressive positions on race. He argued that Black Americans deserved better treatment. He opposed lynching. He called for some level of political participation for Black citizens. Now, let's be clear. By today's standards, his positions were inadequate. He didn't call for full equality. He still believed in gradual change, not immediate justice. But for 1912, this was radical. Did his experience in Buganda influence this? Historians debate it. We can't read Roosevelt's mind, but we know he cited his African travels in speeches. We know meeting educated, sophisticated African leaders like Apollo Kaggwa challenged his assumptions. Roosevelt lost the election to Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson was a disaster for Black Americans. He resegregated federal government offices. He screened the racist film Birth of a Nation at the White House. Many of the modest gains Roosevelt had supported were rolled back. So in a way, Buganda's influence on American politics ended with Roosevelt's defeat. But what happened to that 15-year-old King Roosevelt indirectly encountered? Daudi Chwa II would rule Buganda for 28 years until his death in 1939. As he grew older, he became one of the most important African leaders of the early 20th century. In the 1920s, when British colonial authorities tried to seize more land from Buganda, Daudi Chwa resisted. He wrote essays defending African rights. He argued against European racism. He pushed back against the British claim that Africans needed to be civilized. In one powerful essay, he wrote, "We Africans have our own culture, our own systems of government, our own achievements. We do not need Europeans to teach us how to live." This was incredibly bold for a colonized king to say in the 1920s. Daudi Chwa also modernized Buganda. He promoted education. He encouraged economic development. He tried to balance preserving traditional culture while adapting to a changing world. He even sent Buganda students to study abroad, something Roosevelt would have appreciated, given his respect for education. When Daudi Chwa died in 1939, Buganda mourned he'd led his kingdom through incredibly difficult times. Colonialism, World War I, the Great Depression, while maintaining Buganda's identity and dignity. His son, Mutesa II, would later become the first president of independent Uganda in 1963. So that 15-year-old King Roosevelt heard about in 1909, he became a symbol of African resistance to colonialism and a bridge between traditional monarchy and modern statehood. So what do we learn from this story? This wasn't luck. This wasn't an accident. Buganda built a sophisticated political system over centuries. They had parliament, courts, infrastructure, military power, and diplomatic relationships. African political sophistication didn't start with colonialism. It existed long before Europeans arrived. Roosevelt could have read about Africa in books, but books written by Europeans told him Africans were savages. Actually going to Buganda and meeting Prime Minister Kaggwa, that changed things. You can't deny what you've seen with your own eyes. Roosevelt didn't become an anti-racist crusader after visiting Buganda. His transformation was partial, incremental, and incomplete. But even small shifts matter. Even acknowledging, "Maybe I was wrong about this," is significant. Why don't American schools teach about Buganda? Why don't we learn about African kingdoms with parliaments and legal systems? Because colonial powers had a vested interest in claiming Africans were uncivilized. It justified colonialism. It justified slavery. It justified taking land and resources. If you admit that Buganda had a 600-year-old democracy, that narrative collapses. Buganda still exists today as a kingdom within modern Uganda. The current Kabaka, Ronald Muwenda Muteb II, is a direct descendant of the kings Roosevelt heard about. The Lukiiko still meets. Buganda culture thrives. The history continues. And stories like Roosevelt's visit remind us. African civilizations have always been sophisticated, complex, and worthy of respect. We just weren't taught about them. In 1909, Theodore Roosevelt went to Africa expecting to find savages. Instead, he found King Daudi Chwa's Kingdom of Buganda, a 600-year-old monarchy with a parliament, a prime minister, courts, an army, and a sophistication that rivaled many European states. It challenged him, it surprised him, and whether he fully understood it or not, it changed him. If this story surprised you too, consider subscribing. There are hundreds of African kingdoms, leaders, and histories you've never heard of. Not because they weren't important, but because nobody taught you. Let's change that. Next time, we'll explore more about Buganda's history, how they resisted colonialism, how they preserved their culture, and how a teenage king became one of Africa's greatest leaders. Thanks for watching.